Hey guys, welcome to another episode of Blitz Growth. Very excited to have you here because we have an amazing guest today. Tamsen Webster is an absolute expert, and there's so much we're going to learn from her today. She was a TedX executive producer, founder of her own company, all-round expert in ideas generation. She's described herself as the idea whisperer and has worked with many huge brands like Weight Watchers, Verizon, Johnson & Johnson, and a ton more. In this episode, we're going to dive into 20 plus years of expertise Tamsen has in developing the perfect storyline, brand position, and how to generate amazing ideas and execute on them. So Tamsen, thank you so much.
Oh, I'm delighted. Thanks for having me, Jack.
So I love starting out the podcast with this question. So what is your sort of elevator pitch to hook people's attention when you're kind of having a conversation with someone? It might be at a bar, at a coffee shop, at a conference. What's kind of your quick 1-2 sentences that gets people hooked and interested in learning more about you and having a conversation with you?
I usually describe myself as an English to English translator, and that I help experts translate their expertise into language and concepts that anybody can understand.
Nice. Okay. I love the English to English.
Yeah. Well, it ends up being actually really different kind. We can use the same words and just not actually communicate what we're trying to communicate at all. So that's really the problem that I help solve. And I love working with founders and small and medium business owners about that, because they run into that a lot, and all for very good reason.
Yeah, I think brand positioning, storytelling, all of these things you don't even think about until it's too late, really. But hopefully it's going to change
not working,
today.
and you're like, I think maybe we need to work on something with this. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's hopefully going to change today. Just rewinding a little bit, I know you've had so much experience in this, but sort of what got you involved in this particular line of work? Because it is kind of strange being in the idea generation and English to English, kind of like that's the profession that you've
Message
created.
strategy. Yeah. And message strategy is like the sub. Yeah. So I would say that I'm a strategist by nature. Like I just love to figure out how to make things work and how to make things real, like how to close that gap between aspiration and actual. Like, I love that. But I came into like working in each phase, right? Coming up with the idea, strategizing how you talk about it, and then strategizing how you actually present it. So I've ended up doing all that work. Mostly because, I mean, from a professional standpoint, I've studied marketing as an undergrad, and I chose that field because it felt like the most creative of the employable degrees. Because when I was in college, it was, I don't know, 8 recessions ago, and it was not a great time. And so even though I loved the arts and all of that, I was like, I like money. So I wanted to be employable. And so I really started in marketing. And what I found working as a marketer was that there were aspects of it that I absolutely loved and aspects of it that I absolutely did not. And my career has really been a matter of just tightening and tightening and tightening to that very small slice of what I love to do, where there's major issues, and where there's not a lot of other people doing this work. And that is, what I refer to as message strategy, the thing that really bridges the gap between your brand position and what you have to do and say every day. That to me is what your message is meant to do. And there's just not a lot of resources out there for it. There's not a lot of information out there, but many, many times that's where marketing, sales, investor pitching, all of it breaks at that point of message.
Yeah, it's kind of like that X factor. Some brands have their messaging and storytelling so well planned out, so well executed on, and you can tell those brands because they're always talked about. They're the ones that create the experience, and it's definitely that X factor between no matter how much money you have or how much money you raise or whatever it is, it's kind of like comes back to this messaging and storytelling that makes the company stand out. So it is sort of really interesting.
It is. And I would say that the companies and brands that do it well are the brands that, this is going to sound strange, but that don't try so hard. And what I mean by that is, where a message can fail is the same reason why a brand can fail. And And that is when there is a disconnect between what a company says it is and what it does and what it actually is and what people's actual experience of it is. And so this is where brand can fail because in my mind a brand isn't what a company says its brand is. A brand is what, is people's sum total of their experiences with you. And so I may have a one opinion of a brand that you, Jack, have a completely different opinion of based on those experiences. And so, my favorite example, it's easy to beat up on this, but like United with Fly the Friendly Skies. Unless you're like a million miler on United, like it typically is not a terribly friendly airline. And so that's a great example of brand just not matching up because they say one thing, but the vast majority of people's experience is something else. And yeah, the tagline is part of the message and how they say that, but to me, messaging is how you translate and enact your brand, like positioning and all of that every day. Um, and that breaks when you are saying something different than who you are, what you mean, and what you believe. And eventually, over time, people's experiences reveal what the true nature of your brand is, and, that's why it fails. So the ones that do it well are the ones that have done the work to not try to kind of fill the gap between where they are and where they wanna be. They've actually found the power in what they are right now. And that's really what I try to work with clients to do, is to say, "Listen, there's power in who you are right now and what you are and what you do right now. Let's find that, because that's gonna be a lot easier to sustain over time."
Yeah. So not setting the expectation too high, essentially.
Well, not setting it too far. I mean, that's the thing. I
Hmm.
think I used the phrase before of like that gap between, aspirational and actual. Um, you can't just, a brand isn't a wish. Like that isn't what it is. Like you can't just say, "Well, I wish people thought about this about me," and then not actually do the things that are required for them to think that. And that's, it a product problem, a brand problem will never be solved by a message ever. And so that's where, that's really step one. And I think a lot of times people try to start with the brand and then build backwards. I was like, no, 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 no. Start with a company, start with the idea, start with, why you do what you do the way that you do it, and then build forward. Not only will you have an easier to maintain and sustained brand and message, it's also gonna be a lot less I mean, it's a lot more differentiated because it's gonna be rooted in what makes you and your brand different and distinct.
Hmm. Got it. So if you're starting a company or you're maybe early on right now, work on the product, work on what your unique value proposition is, and then start working on your storytelling and branding. Is that kind of like the order you would suggest someone kind of
I mean,
just developing a new company would do?
I would, so almost, yeah. Yeah, I think branding comes last, frankly. I mean, a lot of ways. Like the branding in the sense of graphic identity and like how you capture all of this in a tagline. Yeah. But what I've learned in my experiences is that messaging and storytelling are actually, and value prop are pretty inseparable. And they're inseparable because the vast majority of what I help companies do is build their is particularly startups and younger companies, is really distinctly find that it is to articulate their value proposition in a more distinct way. And so here's how it ties into storytelling. If you're the founder of a company, you told yourself a story, whether you realize it or not, about why you needed to start that particular company that does that particular thing in that particular way. You may not realize that you built a whole story around this, but your brain created a whole explanation about, in the sea of other people solving that problem, why you needed to do it and why you needed to do it in a different way. And so my approach with companies and with founders is to say, listen, to find your message, to find your story, to find your value proposition. Actually, all three of those are simply embedded in what was that explanation that you created for yourself. Because if we can go back and recreate the conditions, that created the idea in your mind, then we can recreate the conditions for that idea in somebody else's. We can go back to somebody else and say, "Hey, don't you wanna solve this problem? So did we. We saw that most people were thinking about it this way. We saw it this way. This is why we saw it that way, why it was so important. So that's why we developed, founded, produced X." Like, and then all of a sudden you have a really clear explanation for not only what you do, but why and how, right? How you do what you do the way that you do it. Um, it's already in a story format, and you have a very succinct way, usually of capturing the value proposition that entails, because you're saying, "If you wanna solve this problem, you solve it this way," right? And that's what
Mhm.
we do.
Interesting. So, when you're working with these startups on your brands, what are some of the big mistakes that you see them making? Like maybe they're doing an elevator pitch, maybe they're trying to acquire their first 1,000 customers. What are some things that they're doing wrong when it comes to maybe messaging, brand positioning, or storytelling, or even idea generation? I'm sure you come across some guys who are just like, that was just a bad idea.
Um, yeah, I mean, I thankfully, I see that the least of all, where, you push on something and, um, there actually isn't a way to connect what somebody's idea is to a question that an audience actually has right now. That's always the first test. Like, does your product, service, business answer a question that, an audience large enough to sustain you um, actually has right now? Not the question you wish they had, not the question deep down they have, like a question they would actually Google, or they would actually agree that they want an answer to. So I would say that, the mistake is less that they don't actually have something that answers that question. The mistake is that they haven't articulated that question. So what often times happens is we lead with, a discussion about what we do in a way that answers our own questions about it, not our audience's questions about it. And what I mean by that is that we tend to talk about our companies from the perspective of people who are already convinced that they're the right answer, right? I like to call it yes-assuming, because we're assuming that somebody already understands and agree with this, but they don't. And so that leads to, I think, one of the second big things is that the case that we make for our companies or products or services is our case, the case that makes sense to us. But the whole approach that I try to teach companies to do is that you actually need to build your audience's case. You need to build the case of someone who isn't already convinced that this is a good idea, why it would be a good idea. And pro tip here, the features and benefits are not gonna be what's gonna do it. Like, if that's the features and benefits only come in once somebody understands the basic nature of your company and what it does. Does that answer
Okay,
your
so first
question?
step is, yep, definitely does.
Yeah.
And just to clarify it for some of the listeners, so first step is to identify the problem, clearly articulate the solution, how you're unique, and then go into your benefits and features.
I mean, yeah, I think it's but I would say that the benefits and features are, they are, let's call they are like step 6 of 6, right? Like that, I mean, it really starts with, yes, you absolutely got it right with the problem that you solve, but the problem that you solve needs to be an kind of an active, urgent problem with your audience right now, and not one where you are, like, coming in from on high and saying, "You know what your real problem is?" I mean, they're looking to, meet a carbon footprint, increase their conversions, get better quality leads. Like, that's what they care about right now, and there may be some bigger thing that comes from that, but, what are they gonna get hired, fired, promoted for, right? Like, that's where you need to be starting. Like, you need to be starting from that perspective. So, for instance, people don't come to me because they're like, "I need to find the red thread of my company, Tamsin." They're like, "We need to be more successful in investor conversations." Okay, well, let's start there, right? Because that's how I can anchor it. Like, if you wanna improve the probability of success with those conversations, that's the question. Here's the value proposition. Like, the value proposition is a combination of, "I'm gonna get you that, the thing that you want, via a means you don't expect." And in my case, it's the best way to improve probability of success, right, is to build the story. Let's say your investors will tell themselves about you. Okay, because and that's what I help people do. I help founders build the stories that their investors will tell themselves about the company. Um, so it is about finding that problem, but it's about kind of creating that case and understanding that you can't just so it's a talk I just started giving last week. The thing that we do over and over again, in kind of marketing, sales, brand messaging is that because we've been taught this, and it's 2/3 right, is to present problem and solution. You have a problem, we've got a solution, right? Okay, like it's 2/3 right. The reason why it's 2/3 right is because and we can look at this from a whole bunch of different directions, but let's just look at it from a basic logic standpoint. I'm gonna pull out some Aristotle on you, Jack, because the basic minimum viable argument, right, which means it's the minimum viable case that you can make for anything, requires 2 pieces of information to reach a conclusion. So, for example, uh, to reach the conclusion that the dog that's behind me, I don't know if you can see any of his legs popping up, that dog is an animal, right? Which you're like, "Well, I don't." Yeah, okay, but your brain is immediately making the case that, okay, A, dogs are animals, right? That is a dog. You're gonna have to take me on faith on that. I know you can't see it, and therefore that dog is an animal. You see, it's 3 pieces of information, 3. Problem and solution is not just, "That's a dog," because that's a dog, right? Like, that's what happens when we do problem and solution is we're saying, "The problem is you don't have our solution yet." It's not a viable argument, right? We have to actually present something else. And so this is what, this is what I'm talking about when we have to add something else. And what I talk about when I work with clients on this is that we need to surface what I call the silent assumption, that there is some other piece of information that explains, and it's not a feature or benefit, why that solution is the only logical solution for that problem, given what your audience believes, right? So, for instance, so I have, I do a lot of work with B2B startups in particular, and there's a startup that, well, I was just working with today. So they're a startup. They're based in New York right now. They're called Dollar Ride, and they they help solve what are known as transit deserts, basically parts of cities where public transportation doesn't easily reach. So, for instance, like in New York, Brooklyn is a big part of that, and I believe the Bronx is also a big transit desert. It's very, very difficult to get. There's not a lot of bus routes there. The subway doesn't go there, and yet tons of people are living there and moving there, and businesses are there. So it's a big problem, and they're there to solve it. Okay. When we first started working together, they said, "Well, we use technology to solve transit gaps." Okay, well, that tells me what you are, but it doesn't tell me why why you and only you have the right solution here. And why, if I'm an investor, I would want to invest in that because I'm like, okay, but technology transit. Okay, I understand the words that you said. So this is English, right? But there's not that third thing. There's not this silent assumption that makes me go, oh, right. So we started working together and we said, all right, so what's the question that they're solving? And the question is, of course, how to resolve this problem of transit gaps. Businesses are asking this question. People who work in these businesses are asking this question, or live in these areas are asking this question. And what we established was, okay, well, there's a problem here, and the problem is that the routes that exist for public transportation don't match where the ridership now lives, right? Because the routes were established a long time ago where businesses and people lived in different places, and the routes haven't been updated The ridership totally has, right? So he looked at this and goes, okay, we've got a gap between routes and ridership. But he also, because his family, operates in this area, he's like, but there's all these informal transit networks that exist. There are things like called dollar vans and things like that. There are these small business owners with fleets of cars that are in these areas, but they can't connect with the people that need to go to these areas. So he goes, all right, I'm a tech entrepreneur. And I know, here's the silent assumption that gets surfaced, that data is the key to discovery, right? Like if that's all we're looking for here is information. We're looking for information about where the people are. We're looking for information about where the businesses are. And we're looking for information about the drivers. He's like, I can solve this problem. So he basically said, so what his company does, Dollar Ride does, is they deliver the data that closes the gap between routes and ridership. And because they do that, right, they're able to solve the transit gap, right? So now when they talk about what they do, they say Dollar Ride delivers the data that helps close the gap between routes and ridership, right?
Mm,
That are getting in the way
much
of,
clearer.
transit. Right. And it's just like, oh, okay. So now it's not just a mobility, technology mobility company. It's not just we use data. It's we use data to deliver, we deliver the data these people need to close the gap between routes and ridership. And that's really where we're trying to get to. But in order to do that, like that really was kind of Sue's mental process of going, we need to solve this problem. What's the true nature of that problem? Okay, why I have a solution for how to solve it, but, I know data can solve it, but why? Well, because data can help us discover this. Oh, so that's why he's gonna build, he built this platform, 2 platforms actually, one that delivers data about the routes and one that delivers data about the ridership. And now he's got a much more effective way of talking about what he does. And he was just telling me the other day that, they're already a quarter of their way to their next round of funding. And it's much, much faster than it's been before because he's got now that clarity about how to talk about what he does. Again, still words that people understand. We just translated it into concepts that were even more fundamental to people and more understandable.
Got it. No, it's absolutely fascinating because, yeah, when you start out with his first value proposition, it's very vague and you don't really know what he's talking about. And then
Right.
I would say the new and improved version, you get a much better understanding of what the business actually does. So I can see how that helps. And then you mentioned the red thread theory. Now,
Yes.
I know you kind of invented this, and is this something that businesses or people can use to figure out what that new and improved messaging is? And if it is, what's kind of like the steps or the processes in there?
Yes. Yes, so 100%. Like, so the red thread, it got its name because it refers to there's a phrase that tends to be more common in Europe than it is here called the red where people say, "Okay, what's the red thread of something? What's the thing that makes this make sense? What's the logical progression of ideas that makes this all kind of put together?" So I was like, "All right, I'm created a process for a logical progression of ideas. Here's this awesome name for the thing. I'm going to call it the red thread." And the structure is essentially what, in theory, it's what I've talked about before. So since we tell ourselves stories to justify what we do, my thought was, well, how do you structure those stories? Like, okay, well, how do I build that story? Well, and the answer actually was hiding in plain sight because the answer was lying in the stories that we tell other people. Because the stories we tell other people have certain elements because that's how we make things make sense. So those elements are the same ones that we have, and so that's what the red thread is. It's those elements of all stories, both the ones that we tell other people and the ones that we tell ourselves that are required for it to make sense. So in a story that we tell other people, we have a goal, that's the first one. So something somebody wants, right? And that's when a story starts. The minute we find out something somebody wants and doesn't yet have. So the Star Wars movies are very famous illustrations of all this. But, so Luke starts out, he's a bratty kid, wants to be a pilot, wants to get off the planet of Tatooine. All right. Second thing all stories have is a problem that the main character doesn't know about that gets in the way, right? So Star Wars, even if you haven't seen it, you know that Darth Vader is a big part of that, right? So there's forces of good and evil beyond which Luke didn't even know about, but he has to solve that problem, right, before he can get the thing that he wants. So all stories have a goal and, what I call a goal, the thing that somebody wants, and a problem, which is the kind of what's really getting in the way, something they didn't see that's getting in the way. Yeah, exactly. Now this next piece, so important. This is what all stories have and what virtually no messages have. And this is where messages break because all stories, all stories has something that's called a moment of truth, where there is a moment where some piece of information is either recalled or revealed, right, which changes the course of everything else. So I mean, the most famous one, at least in the Star Wars franchise, is actually in the second movie when Darth Vader says to Luke, "I am your father," right? Which that revelation changes everything, and that's what the whole third movie's about. But even in the first movie, where all of a sudden, like, he remembers that he can use the Force, right? And then he's like, "Oh, I'm gonna use the Force to see if I can, like, make this impossible shot that's gonna blow up the headquarters of the dark side and Darth Vader people." Um, and he does, and he does, and he does, and he wins, and he not only is he, as a pilot, woohoo, gets what he wants, but he saves the galaxy at the same time. So that moment of
Happy
truth.
story.
Yes, exactly. That moment of truth is critical because that moment of truth completes what's necessary for the story to make sense, because without that moment of truth, the ending won't make sense. We won't know why the person does what they do. It just, just won't make sense. Like the story doesn't make sense without that moment of truth. So that moment of truth has to exist in a message as well. And so this is where we have to kind of find that piece. We have to find, again, what I'm increasingly I refer to it in the book as a truth statement, but it's an assumption about how the world works, right? That your audience would agree with. So that piece is in there. Fourth piece, we're almost at the end, is the change that that moment of truth makes possible, right? So because Luke remembers that he can use the Force, right? He then uses it, right, to attack the Death Star and win, get the happy ending, right? So that's both the last two things. The change, right? Okay, instead of just trying to do this with my, like, pilot abilities, I'm gonna use the Force, and then it's that decision, that's the change,
It's a
and then there's the action,
differentiator.
yeah, exactly, and so those are the pieces. So we need a goal, something somebody wants, a problem that gets in the way, a truth that makes that problem impossible to ignore, a change which resolves the tension, right? And the conflict, gets somebody what they want, and then the actions are the specific way to do that. So all ideas can be broken down into those elements, and it ends up being something where once you've done that, not only are you kind of you're kind of stretching the idea out to see its component parts, um, and you can do that, you can kind of make sure they're all strong, but again, built in is now a way to talk about your idea that that immediately makes sense to people because it's how we make things make sense.
Mm, absolutely fascinating. I'm sure not enough people think about this at all.
No,
I love this
they
theory, and
don't.
it's really, really interesting. Is it when you're having conversations with brands, people at TEDx? Because I know you talk and help a lot of the speakers at TEDx. Um, are there any kind of like brands or people that you'll say you give as an example? So I know you gave American Airlines, you gave Star Wars. What are some brands that are kind of doing their idea description, or their idea is really solid and their messaging is really good, and you would say these are people who are
Mm.
doing what I'm trying to do with you really, really well?
Yeah. I wish there were more that I can immediately give examples to. But there's a couple, so there's a few examples. One strangely enough actually is the newest version of eHarmony commercials. And the only reason why I know this, happily married, have been for a while, um, is because they had a series of commercials that didn't do this. So I actually was able to just by chance, because I do these, I do a video series, and for a while I was doing a video series called "What's Missing from This Message," and I saw this eHarmony commercial. And I'm like, that commercial makes no sense, and I can recap it for you because it's a picture of like cute guy and dog, and he goes, "This guy is my best friend," referring to the dog. That's what I want in a partner, and that's why I trust eHarmony. So let's recap.
Okay.
I want a
Finding
best friend and
dogs.
a partner. That's why I trust eHarmony. Do you see this as like it's problem
Mm,
solution, not enough information. They're like
dog's
it
best
doesn't
friend, not
yeah,
romantic.
you're like, "What does that how does that doesn't make any sense." So, and you can't see this commercial anymore because they pulled them all down, and I'm like, "Dang it," but
Not
trust me on this,
surprised.
they exist. They have new commercials out. They're these real love commercials, so they may be wider spread, but the ones that I've seen are for same-sex couples. And but the messaging is on point. So it's, they set up the copy, but essentially the copy you could be translated to, I want a partner that's a fit with me in my life. Um, and then they say this phrase, which was not in the previous set of ads. We're the app that gets to know you better so that we can match you better. That's why I trust eHarmony, right? Like, and so you're like, and
Got it.
what they're
That's a
doing is
differentiator.
they're surfacing that silent assumption, and what I mean by that is they're surfacing this, they're saying it in their own language, but they're saying, somebody who knows me better is going to like the better somebody knows me, the more likely the match is going to be. Like the more likely that that person's going to fit me. And by articulating that, now it makes sense. There's like, okay, I want somebody who's a good fit. The more somebody knows me, the more likely the fit's going to be. And then because that's what eHarmony does, that's what I'm gonna trust. So, I think, like, that is just a beautiful, like, short example of seeing like, that's the I know nobody can see the before, but the after is so powerful. So that anytime you spot someone going, like, I love it when I'm like, "Oh, oh, oh, they did it." They stated the silent assumption. Great examples of this too, again, one that I use in one of my talks, infomercials are awesome about this. Like, if you
Mm,
go back and look at,
yeah.
like, the original Slap Chop commercial, um, the Vince Offer guy, he's like, you know, "You wanna eat healthy, but you hate
Mm,
making salad," right? And he's like and it's basically so the assumption that he surfaces, which is great, which is you would eat healthier if it were easier, right? And then it's like, one hand is easy, slap chop. Therefore, right, the belief that they're instilling in people is, I will eat healthier with slap chop because it's easier, right? And so it's it really is a matter of, like I said, it's so common now for people to only have 2 pieces that it's actually really rare to be able to point you to something where somebody actually gets that extra piece in there and you're like, "Yes, yes, that's the piece." So, that's the
got
best
it.
I can offer right now.
No, no, that's great. And yeah, we'll put in some examples into the show notes as well so that people can find those. But essentially, for that aha moment, like I feel like that's a good analogy of it as
Yeah,
well. To kind
definitely.
of
It's
like
you're creating a little
dumb it down a
epiphany.
bit for some of us. um, I would say so for that aha moment. Can that be like industry disruptions, statistics, things about your product or your brand? What is like,
It's
for
best
example, in the eHarmony, it was more about their product and what they do different. So, what are kind of
but it was
things that
based on
brands
an
could look at?
assumption that the people they want would believe about the world. So that's what I would say. So my definition of a silent assumption, which is what's necessary to create an aha moment. You have to surface something that hasn't previously been said. The best ones of that are a deep-seated belief about how something works, how
So, like
people work.
debunking that or
Say
saying
again?
that? Like debunking that deep belief or saying that
No,
deep
no, you
belief?
wanna use it as the stepping stone to the aha moment. So even if you debunk a deep-seated belief, you need to replace it with something else, right? So you might say, "You can't measure what you can't measure what you can't manage what you can't measure." Okay, we need to flip that, right? And that's the negative version. What's the positive frame on that would be, you can only manage what you can measure. That's why we've created a measurement program, right? Like, data is the key to discovery. That's why we deliver the data, on both routes and ridership that businesses need to close transit gaps. Um, so my favorite place to start with these are everyday sayings, proverbs, idioms. I've got, clients that have used seeing is believing. Um, I have another client, another B2B client that, so they create, so they work with, they work with large construction heavy things. So think about large retailers, car dealers, for instance. They build a lot of stuff. These are places that have climate goals that they're trying to reach, right? So net carbon emissions to be at a certain level. The problem is that those folks are, the very nature of what they're building has carbon emission. They have positively emitting carbon materials all the time. So how can they meet these carbon goals that they've got? Let's say they're trying to get to net zero, where like all things considered at zero. What needs to happen? Well, in this case, we just used math, right? Because I mean, think of it this way: if I have two of something and I need to get to zero, what needs to happen? I need to take
If
2
you
of
got 2 of
those
something, you
things
need to
away.
take 2 away. Yep.
That's right. And if I can't take 2 away, what's my only other option is to create like a negative 2, right? Something that cancels that out. So that's what this company, so that's what we said, to reach 0, right? Every positive needs a negative. So what this company creates is negatively emitting carbon materials. Like, so they actually create materials that have negative emissions, like they absorb carbon. So they're basically saying, okay, if you've got a net zero goal and you're using positive emission carbon materials, I'm messing all my words up. We create negative ones so that you can get to zero. But you see, the sound assumption is stated as just to get to zero, every negative needs a positive or every positive needs a negative. That's why we create negative carbon emission materials. And so that thing, that silent assumption, that truth statement that creates that aha moment, that moment of truth needs to be something that your audience readily agrees with. Doesn't have to be convinced of, just goes, yes, that's true. That if I have a positive and I'm trying to get to 0, something negative has to happen, and then you're like, "Right," which is why we create a negative thing. Or, right, if, and there's tons of examples, like, that I've worked with on my clients on this, but again, it's just what is that. So I like to use math, I like to use everyday sayings, um, principles of science. Every action has an opposite, equal and opposite reaction. A body in motion stays in motion. Like, they are the things that most people would agree with without argument. That is the most powerful thing to articulate as a step, in order to complete the argument for your idea. Does that answer your
Yeah,
question?
and it kinda comes back to your English teaching English sort of thing,
Yeah.
where you're essentially just taking things, making them more clear, and connecting better with the audience, whoever you're talking to, whether it's through a sales deck, whether it's through an Instagram account, YouTube channel, whatever it may be. Essentially giving resonation to all the points that you're giving.
Yes,
One
yes,
question,
it's the thing
because
that makes it go, "Oh," right? And you're right, it
I
absolutely
get
is
it.
an aha
Yeah.
moment. I was so fascinated by, we know what needs to happen, but I was really fascinated in what is the thing that makes that happen, right? And what's fascinating to me in stories is that the moment has a name, right? Actually, it has a bunch of names: penny drop moment, aha moment, epiphany, point of no return, anagnosis, if you wanna get super fancy about it. Um but I was like, "Well, what is the thing?" And so I actually found the name of that thing actually in psychology. So silent assumption comes from psychology, because that's a bit more evocative than the second premise, which is what logic would call it. But, it it is the reason, like, it is the thing that makes everything else make sense. Like, it's because every negative needs a positive to reach to 0 that it makes sense that negative emission carbon materials are the right answer if you're trying to get to net zero, like that, you get to a point where you can't unhear that because you're like, well, how else are we going to get there? Like, we can't, like, some of these things are always going to be positively emitting carbon. Like, they're always going to be carbon positive. So, how do we get to zero? There has to be a negative. And so that's really what you're trying to get to, is to say, why does it have to be this way? Now, I could explain it and it can sound straightforward. Is this easy work? No. Because these silent assumptions are silent. I like to think of them as lines of code. They're like our operating system. They are so deep set into how we see the world, that research refers to them, many of them, as primals. So for instance, there are people who fundamentally see the world as a hierarchical place, that there are just people that people are meant to have a natural hierarchy. And then there are people who are like, that's bananas. We're all connected, like everybody's equal. And but you can see that these primals, like, one set is going to be your customer base and the other set is not. And so if you don't know, like, if you haven't actually surfaced that for yourself, or certainly if you haven't surfaced it for you're going to be going like, why don't people get it? Why aren't I converting these people? Because fundamentally there are certain people that you never will, or there's people, because you haven't surfaced it, they're just the story isn't that just it just isn't making sense yet.
So you've really got to choose your ideal customer or target market and
100%.
stick to
Yeah.
servicing them, not try and service everybody.
You can't. And when we say
Yeah.
everybody, so my favorite example of this was, the actor Seth Rogen, he was
Yep.
starting a podcast, and and someone asked him, like, "Well, who's the podcast for?" And he was like, "Everyone." And I'm like, "Oh my gosh." Seth Rogen is not for everyone. Just think about, like, I mean, he's not. Like, I would imagine that ultra conservative, folks, Seth Rogen, not a fan. People who don't agree with, recreational marijuana use, not gonna be a fan. So when we say everyone, what we really mean is everyone who sees the world the way that we do, everyone who shares the silent assumptions that we do. So, how can you possibly talk to those people if you don't actually know what your own silent assumptions are? If you haven't actually figured out, like, okay, who are we? Like, what are the assumptions that are driving what we do the way that we do it? Because if you don't know it for yourself, there's no way you can explain it to somebody else. And if they don't hear it, then they can't know that you're really for them, right? They can't hear it. They can just judge for themselves whether or not. Sorry, that's my dog shaking out in the back. He's getting to a point where it's like, it's time for a walk, mom. But if you don't know that, you can't articulate it. And if you can't articulate it, people can't hear it. And if they can't hear it, then they can't be persuaded that you're the right answer for them. Yeah. So it's really important to really surface these. And I'm just on the beginning edges of this idea myself and how to explain it and get it out to people. But I am really convinced that this is the key to cracking why so much messaging and even branding doesn't work. It's because it isn't just, brand values. These are fundamental assumptions about how, like, the world, does or doesn't operate. There he is. There's my dog, making a guest appearance.
Nice. No, I think all of this is something that more people need to think about. A lot of the times they jump to, things that shouldn't be done yet, like rolling out new products, new features, new all these different types of things that they're trying to do to acquire new customers or get more investors, when really all they need to do is come back to that core value proposition, the red thread, um, and figure that out first, and
Yeah.
then make their decisions based off once they've figured that out. But
Yeah, because,
really,
I
really
mean,
interesting.
your products, like all the choices that you make with your brand are the result
Mm.
of your own. He's starting to pull things off my desk. Um, it- or part of your own kind of operating system. And to me, that's what what the red thread really is. I'm sorry. It's just, he's going nuts over there. I don't know if you can see him. He's like, yep. Uh, and so if you really want to have a brand that's strong, you need to understand what makes like your company strong. And that really does start with the red thread. And I'm going to have to sign off here pretty soon, or else this dog's going to destroy my office.
No worries. I was going to say, we didn't get to talk about a lot of the idea stuff, but I think at this point, there's enough for everybody to go off. And, Tamsen, thank you so much for sharing all of this. It's really interesting. We're going to link to a bunch of your stuff, but where's the best place for people to find out more about you, about what you do, about how you help brands or people?
Sure.
Where's
Yeah.
kind of
I
like
think the
the
best place
direction
is
they
my
should head?
newsletter. That's where you get to see kind of new ideas percolate first. And so you can go that tamsenwebster.com/newsletter. It's weekly. I trade off every week. One week it'll be kind of a quick take on a message, on kind of a thing that you can use in your own messaging. And then on off weeks, it is kind of some cool story or study I've used that you can kind of use to make your own message make more sense.
No, really appreciate the time, and we'll link to all of that. All the listeners out there, make sure to leave a review and let us know how much you enjoyed Tamsen's podcast. And we'll hear from you hopefully soon. And yeah, I really appreciate you guys tuning in. Thanks, Tamsen.
Thanks so much.
Hey guys, we put a bunch of effort into making great content for this YouTube channel. So please hit subscribe, leave us a comment, hit like, and tell a few friends about it.